You're listening to the Walled Garden podcast. This podcast is a part of the Walled Garden online community, a community dedicated to sharing and discussing philosophy, beliefs, ideas, and creativity among all types of people, in order to gain new insight on some of life's biggest questions and make the most of how we live. We appreciate you joining us.
Hello and welcome to the Walled Garden podcast. My name is Simon Drew, and today I have a conversation for you that I had with none other than Michael Tremblay. Now, Michael is somebody who I've had on the podcast multiple times before. I think about 3 times before this on the Practical Stoic podcast. So those of you who have been listening for a long time will have heard him around a bit. But for those of you who haven't heard Michael before, Michael is a philosopher. He's just finished his PhD, actually focusing on the pedagogy of Epictetus, which we get into a little bit in this interview. And he's also recently started working with another person who I've had on the podcast before, Caleb Ontiveros. Now, Caleb is the owner of the Stoa meditation app, which many of you are probably a part of. And so Michael is now teaming up with Caleb and basically putting out some great educational content on there about how you can apply Stoic philosophy to your own life. So Michael is somebody who I've come to know as a friend. He's a really great person, really decent guy, and has a lot of wisdom to offer, a lot of practical wisdom. And so today we just have a conversation about philosophy, wisdom, about a few ideas that we've been thinking about lately, and I think you're going to really enjoy this. So the only other thing that I do want to mention before we dive in is, obviously, many of you will know now, unless you haven't been paying attention, the podcast is now the Walled Garden, and that is linked to my collaboration that I'm doing with Kai Whiting, Sharon LaBelle, and Jacob Bush. And so if you want to find out more, go to thewalledgarden.com. And if you've been listening for a long time and you're keen to jump on the website with us and join in this whole project, then you can use the promotional code Practical Stoic, all uppercase, if you sign in for a caretaker membership. So go check that out. We'd love to see you there. And the other way that you can get involved is up until, I think, December, we are running weekly meetups where we focus on a different topic each week, pertaining to the project of the Walled Garden, really solidifying our whole vision for this project. And so we're having a lot of fun with these meetups. We'd invite you to come along, come and join in, and they're absolutely free to attend. So just go to thewalledgarden.com/events. And there you will find links to where you can register for these meetups. We would really love to see you there and to get your own feedback so that you can contribute to our own direction as well. So without any further ado, I want to present to you my conversation that I had with Michael Tremblay. Michael, welcome back. How many times is it now? How many times have we had conversations? Must be at least 3.
I think this is number 4. So hopefully people are still like hearing from me. But I like coming on. So thanks for having me.
Man. Yeah, what's not to like? Hey, it's I think what's cool about the podcast in general has just been, I had this moment the other night, and I'll tell you about this because I had this moment where I finally realized, what the hell, the kinds of people who I'm talking to and the kinds of people who I have contact with and have access to, it's unbelievable. I never thought that I could get to a place where I get to talk to philosophers and, people who are kind of going after these same, kind of goals as me. And same with you, I feel very fortunate that we got to start speaking a while ago, and I got to kind of see you as you progressed along with your PhD and everything, which is awesome. And now you're kind of taking your place in the world with your philosophy. And I guess talk to me about, because I wanted to find out, there's this really kind of funny thing that Jordan Peterson talks about, where he kind of mentions that as a university student, you have that moment where the last day of your university, you're still in that kind of walled garden, you might say, where you've got this little place in your culture carved out for you where people recognize that you have some sort of worth as a citizen because you're studying, you're trying to make something of yourself, and here's your block of time locked away where you're just, you can just study and we'll great. But then as soon as you're outside of that, he talks about how it's like, you can't even get a job at Starbucks. And it's like you go from like one of the most valued members of society to then like, jobless and, what do I do with my life? But, you've mentioned to me that, before this conversation that that period of transformation was like a struggle, but also you've luckily found your way into something really good at the moment. So talk to me about that process. What was that like?
Yeah, it was really, really tough. So for those that don't know me, so I just finished my PhD in philosophy. I guess I defended in May, and then September I started a job. But I was kind of planning to go into academia, and then we can get into academia if we want. There's certain benefits and certain downsides to that, but I kind of had this process of applying to academic jobs, and then I decided to transition away from academia, and then I had this process of applying to industry jobs, so jobs outside of that. And so this was kind of I think it was 13 months from when I applied to my first job to when I started working. So it was 12 months of applying to jobs straight. And it was really, really tough, because when you're in that bubble, I don't know, bubble kind of sounds derogatory, but when you're focused as a grad student, you have kind of one plan, one goal in front of you, as you talked about, the kind of like you're walled in, nobody externally judges you, you have enough food and money to live and survive, and you kind of have that path in front of you. And there's a certain security in that, but at the same time, it comes with a kind of a lack of perspective, or an inability to perceive other options outside of those walls. So I think for a lot of graduate students, and I experienced the same thing, there's a lot of anxiety when you want to step outside, because everybody and look up to inside there is an expert at academic philosophy or academics in general. So you end up with not a lot of experience outside, and you end up with not a lot of like role models or perspectives about what kind of opportunities exist outside of academia. So there's just this process of me kind of educating myself and asking this question of, just like what skills has philosophy given me? And what has philosophy revealed to me that I'm actually really interested in? And then trying to kind of map that on and graph that on to industry. I ended up just starting a job as a consultant just 2 months ago now. And that's great, because consulting is about kind of big picture problem solving, conceptual thinking. And it also is about, you get thrown into a new problem and you have to kind of hyper specialize really quickly. So in that way, it's about like research and learning. And, that very similar to what you kind of get out of philosophy of like, here's this new puzzle, here's this person I don't understand anything about, and I'm going to kind of immerse myself in their worldview. Yeah, that too with consulting is there's this kind of paradigm or perspective adopting, because you have to kind of empathize with the people you're working with and these kind of things. So that's kind of what I found. But I don't know, the coolest thing about industry, I think, is, and when I say industry, I just mean basically anything that's not academia, is there's just so many options. So if you're a professor and you don't like your job, you can basically become a professor somewhere else. But outside of academia, there's endless possibilities for self-transformation. And once I started leaning into that, it became very, very empowering of like, okay, I have so many different avenues and paths to go down. Kind of rambled there, but that's been the last year of my life.
No, man, it's awesome. Like, it's just always good to see people who, they put in the effort to go and, get the degrees and, do the work to contribute to their culture in that way. And then you hope that those people get out and find some meaningful work. And that's obviously what's been happening, which is great. And yeah, I mean, like well, actually, I really wanted to ask this, what was your PhD defense like? Because I've obviously never done one, right? But I've heard that they're pretty grueling. Was it pretty wild, or are they pretty?
I didn't think it was grueling. I generally find defenses really, really enjoyable. And that's as some of the experience of two, because I've done my master's and my PhD. Yeah. So one thing is that you're the expert in the room. I mean, for me, there was a bit of an exception because my external was Brad Inwood, who's one of the best living people in Stoicism in the world. So, I mean, he was probably the expert in the room. But other than that,
can you just like quickly tell me what was your PhD about? Because I'm pretty sure you've told me this before, but I may have forgotten.
Yeah. So the PhD was on Epictetus, who's a Stoic, his education program, basically his pedagogy system.
Okay, cool.
because what you have in the discourses, what Epictetus writes, is you have a series of lectures, but they're not structured like a syllabus would be, for example. So I'm trying to take these lectures, take these conversations he's had with students, and reconstruct them into, okay, well, how did his school work? How did the educational process work? And that was one question. How was the theory structured? And the other question was, what role did training have inside of that? So, there's kind of the lectures, the studying logic, the reading texts, and then there's the practicing, the implementation, and how do those relate to each other? So that was the project, was basically, what is his educational program? How do we understand it? And I think the people have asked that question before, but I think my kind of twist was, what role does training have? So what role does things you do outside of the classroom have in that program?
We're going to have to dive into that. I really want to dive in, but yeah, go on. I kind of cut you off in the middle of talking about the and maybe for people who don't know this, like PhD defense, what's it supposed to be? Isn't it basically you're going into the room with your PhD and your job is to defend it against the critics, I'll
talk about it a bit. So what you do basically, so PhD programs differ depending on where you are in the world. So for example, in the United States, they often have 2 years of coursework. In Canada, they have 1 year of coursework. Something like the UK, they have no coursework. But outside of the coursework, what you do is you write a dissertation. And a dissertation is basically a book. So you have, 3 to 5 years, depending on how long it takes to write a book. And the book must make a substantial original contribution to the literature. And what that means is you must say something that nobody else has said before, and you must argue it well. Or you must research something that nobody else has researched before, and you must discover things people haven't discovered before. And the standard of a PhD is that part of the PhD is of publishable quality. And what something means to be publishable in academia is the same thing, which is that an article gets published when it says something that nobody has said before, and other experts read it and say, okay, this was well done. This does contribute something. It's not ripping off somebody else. It's not reinventing the wheel because there's some paper from 1970 you didn't realize existed. So basically what a PhD defense is you write this book and then you go into a room and you have a world expert from somewhere else in the university. A world expert from somewhere else in the world. So Brad Inwood was at Yale. You have your supervisor. You have an internal, which means somebody from a different department, but at the same school as you, and then an internal, which is somebody from the same department. So somebody else from the philosophy department besides my supervisor that was at Queen's where I did my PhD. And then it's 3 hours. So each of these people have read, they've read your dissertation, they've read your book, they have a list of questions, concerns, comments, and they go through all of these and grill you on them. As much as it's fun to hype it up, it really is a collaborative process for a couple of reasons. Is that you're all super nerds, right? Like, what kind of person would be like, I'm one of the few people that has dedicated my life to studying Stoicism, and I'm going to pick on this other person who has dedicated the last 5 years. It's just not that kind of mindset, right? It's like you're collaborating in this process of getting to know the truth. Another thing is that, I have my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. I did a lot of martial arts before philosophy, and nobody ever fails martial arts gradings. And the reasons for that is that no coach is ever going to be cruel enough to have you come in for the grading if you're not ready. And that's the same way the dissertation defense works, is that your supervisor says, no, this person's ready. So I think there's been one time in the philosophy department where I came from where somebody failed, and that was somebody who said, I want to defend this. And the supervisor said, you're not ready. And he said, I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. So in that way, it's kind of like a celebration and an opportunity to discuss it. And the way I like to think about it for everyone else is think about the thing that you're the nerdiest about, if that's like a book, a movie, a hobby, and you get to be in a room with 6 experts on that, and you get to talk about it for 3 hours. It's not really scary. It's exhausting. It's tiring, but it's not scary. I'm sure some cultures and some people have bad experiences, but wasn't that way for me. It was great. Very fun.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. I can see how that would be fun, especially if you've worked on this for, so many years, and then, you should probably be ready for it by then. And, and then you can actually, it's almost it seems like almost like a rite of passage, for the academic is, now we're going to initiate you into this world by putting you on our level, and let's discuss this and see if you're up for the challenge. Right.
Yeah. Let's discuss it as a peer. Instead of a student. I would say the only other hard thing is because you spent 3 years, like me, I spent 3 years writing it. Someone's grilling you on something you wrote at the beginning, and you're like, oh, you're like, I've read it, but like you don't remember it as well as when you wrote it because it was so
Yeah.
long ago. I think that was the only hard part.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a cool experience, and um, but it is a nice capstone to a PhD. But the PhD is for me, what I benefit from was that 5 years of immersing myself in a subject. That for me was much more transformative
Yeah.
than the one kind of competition at the end, which
Yeah.
just kind of showed off what you had already done.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, man, it's very exciting. And I guess I'm wondering, this whole Epictetus's pedagogy, I'd
Mhm.
really like to discuss that with you because, yeah, like it's a very, very interesting idea that you can kind of look at his writings and then say, well, this is how he would have set up his school. I mean, look, for selfish reasons, I'm going to start asking you these questions because, obviously with Kai and Sharon, I'm setting up this walled garden, and one of the things that we want to do in there is actually, set it up in such a way that this is almost like an online, school, like in the same way that Epictetus would have had his students sitting around and, listening in and having conversations. We want to do that with meetups and everything. And so, yeah, what was, I guess, what were some surprising things that you learned about the kind of pedagogical system of Epictetus?
Surprising is a tough question because I guess I've just been studying the same thing for so long. I've kind of forgot what my assumptions
Yeah.
were coming in,
Yeah.
or what it was like. Oh, that's strange. Um,
What about useful? Maybe a better word. Some
yeah,
useful things.
useful. I mean, useful things is about like so one of the things that I really like about Epictetus and that I think that a lot of people miss and that I think Epictetus gets, and I think what makes him unique is that a lot of people talk about the ignorant non-stoic and they talk about the sage, and so much of the discussion exists as one of those things of like, this is what a non-stoic does and this is what a sage does, as if that's like, we're talking about the person who's like never done a sport in their life, and then we're talking about the decathlon champion, as if that's like the best way to talk about personal training, which is not, right? Like personal training, self-development is about meeting people where they're at, understanding their current level of progress, and then adapting accordingly. So what I find in Epictetus and what I like and what I think he has, because he walked the walk and he got the experience as a teacher, right? Like you can talk about this is what you need to do from an abstract level, right? You can be like, you need to achieve wisdom to become a great stoic. And you can write that as the leader of a school, but it's very different to be engaging with people back and forth every day and seeing their failings and understanding the limitations to human psychology and kind of so Epictetus was very immersed in that. So I think what we find in him is a really good understanding of human failure, human limitations, and incremental human progress. And there's a lot there in that book about taking things slow, about understanding where you're at, about not making false starts, right? So there's this real temptation for students to fall into this kind of egoism about their own intelligence. And you see this, and we all see that. I mean, I was in grad school. I see this, and
I am this.
Yeah,
I fall into this trap.
Yeah. Where it becomes more about it's a very famous Epictetus line, but it becomes more about showing off how much you know than it becomes about actually internalizing the knowledge. But that is just like that's just what happens when you're like working with students and you just like see them failing. And Epictetus is very plugged into that, and that's what I really really like about his stuff. And that's what I found most helpful. And what comes along with that, even though Epictetus is so tough, is also when there's also a kind of self-forgiveness and a kind of self-compassion that I think a lot of Stoics can miss, and I can miss, and everything about like I think I don't know if we've mentioned this before, but one of the most worst things you don't want to be is like once you say, okay, I want to learn Stoicism, I don't want to be angry, I don't want to be extreme in my emotions. Well, then you don't want to be like angry with yourself for getting angry, right? And you don't want to have these kind of these second order feelings. And understanding Stoicism as this thing you progress through, and Epictetus has really helped me think of it that way, has just more self-compassion, which is ironic because he's can be a real hard ass, right? And he's really tough coach, but he's a tough coach working with actual people. And that's what I still like about him, even after working on stuff for 5 years.
Yeah, man. Well, I think that you're exactly right there in terms of the compassionate side of Epictetus. I mean, I have to say, like, I really think that the most important, there's 2 or 3 quotes that I'm often bringing up with my clients from the Stoics. And I find that they are just, there's no depth, there's no bottom to like how much these quotes can help people. One of them is actually from Seneca, where he says, that I'm just this patient in the same hospital as you. You're trying to get better, and we're both just. I've kind of used that as a method for my coaching in terms of saying, well, I'm not here to tell you what to do or how do you live your life, but I'm here to have a conversation with you about this common search for deeper wisdom, and it's in that conversation that we find something better that we can both take away. So that's been really helpful, because I think, it means that it puts me on the same level as everybody and said, like, I'm struggling as well, right? So don't think that I'm going to give you any extra wisdom here. We're just going to talk, right? But also, like, from Epictetus's standpoint, yeah, he says, self-scrutiny applied with self-kindness, is the antidote to a lot of these issues that we're trying to solve through philosophy. And man, the number of people who I work with who it's like, that's the biggest thing they need is self-kindness. The biggest thing that I help them with is like, just learn how to treat yourself as if you're, kind of worth taking care of, or as if you're, like you're a struggling human being like the rest of us. And I love that about Epictetus's stuff, because it's so necessary. And I think you can make, psychological arguments for why it's absolutely the case that we need to not forgive ourselves in that, like, oh, I'm just fine the way I am and that's all good. No, because that's not actually being kind to yourself, right? That's just being like, that's just being weak, and that's not learning how to actually scrutinize. But to scrutinize means to give yourself a little bit of leeway, right? And to also to point out where you're failing, but also to point out that you're a fallible human being, And
yeah.
So yeah, I really like that about his method. I don't know, what else did you discover?
Well, just going on that. Sorry, if I can go back to that, 'cause
yeah.
I really like the idea of just like, there's this idea of like living in accordance with nature, understanding your nature, like, and that involves forgiveness and compassion, and like, with your own fallibility, the same way we want to forgive others, right? And we want to be kind to others. This kind of self-kindness is super, super important. Well, one other thing that I was thinking of, so now the second part is, you asked what is another thing that I like about Epictetus, or I learned about Epictetus. Another thing that I really resonate with as an athlete, and that's what I've been kind of focusing on lately, is his use of athletic metaphor and his comparison of philosophy to sport. Because I was just thinking, because you just used Seneca in the hospital saying we're both patients, and scrutiny and compassion, I think it was the antidote, and those are both medical metaphors, right? And the Stoics love the medical metaphors. So like, we're sick and we're trying to cure ourselves of this illness, of this vice. And then Epictetus, there's value to that, but then that's also framing things negatively, right? Of like, I'm sick and I'm trying to like cut away this disease. And so Epictetus also uses that because it's very common in Stoicism, but he also talks about this like kind of athletic metaphor, which I really like. Because there's the way of like, I'm trying to remove the badness. And then this athletic metaphor is like, no, I'm trying to cultivate this greatness. I'm trying to pursue and move towards Olympic glory and Olympic victory. That is, being virtuous and doing the right thing. Like that's my Olympic games that I'm competing for. And another thing I like about this, which comes back to the self-compassion, is that competition is like an iterative process. It's something you do again, you fail, you go back and you compete the next day. And Epictetus talks about that. He's like, this is doing the right thing is more important than winning the Olympics, because that's like an internal state of like character and virtue instead of just external glory. So we have the Olympic Games whenever we try to do the right thing. We have access to that great competition and that glory. But unlike those athletes, we get to compete. If we fail, we get to compete again tomorrow. We can always keep practicing and always keep going. And so I think that goes back to the self-forgiveness, where it's this iterative process of like, you're going to fail, but you got to like pick yourself off the dirt and go again and keep pursuing that greatness. yeah, so I really, I mean, I'm just an athlete, I'm biased, but I really, really resonated with that kind of discussion of metaphor about this self-cultivation, self-transformation, this pursuit of your own greatness. And that's, I mean, that's he does that more than anybody else. And that's the thing I like about him.
Yeah, yeah. There is like a shift there, right? Like of, do I focus on the negative, or do I focus on what I'm leaving behind, or what do I
Mm-hmm.
focus on what I'm moving towards, right? And I don't know, like I personally really resonate with the way that Seneca talks about these things, because he kind of, he does take the, his metaphor is, illness of the soul, and
Mm-hmm.
something about that. Something about that really resonates with me, because I think that so many of the issues that we deal with today can come down to that definition of illness of the soul. Even incorrect judgments, incorrect aims. Even like Marcus Aurelius said, he said, that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. It's like, there's this part of us that is, whether you call it the psyche, whether you call it the mind, the soul, whatever, it can become sick from time to time when you start falling into these really bad habits. And I think that this idea, but then Seneca focuses even more on the cure, and that's what I like. Is we can cure the soul of our ailments, and it's kind of this kind of medical analogy. I really like that, because I think, for me personally, I think it helps to have more ways to learn how to diagnose myself, and to look within and to say, like, yeah, like I am a little bit sick in this area, and I need, and what do you do? The question is, like, I think that sort of thing would be negative if we stopped at you're sick, but when you have something that is sick, you don't just stop there and be like, well, you're sick, and so away with you, disgust and all that sort of stuff. No, you say, okay, well, let's nourish it. Let's nurture it back to health. Let's give it the medicine that it needs. And the medicine is to be found through philosophy. And I think, again, I'm going to bring up Jordan Peterson, because he said something that just completely shifted my perspective on this, right? And it finally put a bunch of information together. He did a whole lecture where he was talking about how he believes that lack of virtue literally makes people sick, right? And I think that there are great arguments to be made from that. And so philosophy, in a way, is a way of bringing a little bit more virtue into our lives that can cure us of, the soul's ailments. I don't know. What do you think of that?
I really like the medical metaphor. I want to say that I wasn't judging that. There's a reason it's a reason it's super popular.
Yeah.
And as you said, I don't think it's negative. If it was just like kind of shaming, like there's something wrong with you. You have like,
but so many people fall into that habit in Stoicism, right? Like, so many people fall into the depths of that shame and guilt, judgment, and and I find, especially men as well, it's very easy for them to fall into those really harsh, judgmental patterns. I don't know. Like, have you found that with yourself, or?
I mean, a bit. I haven't found it too bad. Mostly, mostly Stoicism has helped me. I think that you can. I think maybe at the start, like everybody else, you kind of go through this period where, like, wow, my response to things are up to me. And so it's my responsibility, and it's my fault if I feel bad. Oh, I feel bad. I'm like, I've failed. Yeah, it's a lot of pressure for like every single. It's like, whoa, calm down. So maybe there's like a bit of that at the start as you're kind of wrestling with it. But once you get to understand Stoicism more, and you understand that it's like not saying that a beginner should be able to handle every moment perfectly virtuously. It's saying the exact opposite. That's why you need so much training and progress and work to become virtuous. That's helped me really forgive myself, because pre-philosophy, pre-Stoicism, I think I had a lot of shame about emotion, which is that I thought that emotions were like this kind of irrational, animalistic part of me And it's like, why can't I feel the way I want to feel? Like, what's wrong with me? And then so Stoicism really helped actually like remove this kind of like shame and self frustration, I would say. I don't think I ever got to a point of hatred, because it was like, well, these emotions are like a part of the way that I relate to the world, part of the way that I think about things, and they're my responsibility to cultivate, and I have control over them, or at least like responsibility to develop them and change them over time. So that really, really helped. Speaking to that previous point, I mean, I think you gave a really interesting point about, lack of virtue literally makes you sick. Like, we want to be looking, I mean, I think health is a really interesting concept. I don't want to nerd out too much, but we spend the entire time talking about what health is, what that even means. But at the very least, we certainly agree we want health to be holistic, right? We want health to be a relationship between, to include the relationship between the mind and the body.
Yeah.
Somebody's a serial killer but has like, a six pack is not the person. It's not like we don't say, wow, that's a very healthy, great human being. And vice versa, right? If I think there's definite value to cultivation of the body in a certain degree of health, even if you're working on your character, physical health, I should say. But yeah, I mean, it's very clear to me that a lack of moderation, an inability to be, I don't know, courageous or wise, or any of these kind of lacking any of these virtues, is going to have specific physical implications, and these things are related. And I suppose the real insight there, or maybe I'm speaking for you, but maybe one of the insights Pearson's bringing up is that people don't talk or think enough about this relationship. This relationship is very clearly there. I don't think anybody would argue against that once you said, like, look, if you have character problems, that's going to affect your physical health in a variety of ways. But it's just relating that, like making that attention, breaking down this dichotomy, I suppose, between the body and the mind is a good direction to go. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I think it's such an important direction to go. I mean, we're living in a time where, if you're going to university at the moment to study psychology, it's like you're definitely going to have a job going into the future, because that industry is blowing up. It's like, everybody needs a counselor, everybody needs a therapist, psychologist. Like it's we're living in a time where mental health is just kind of, exploding with all of these issues, and I think that it's interesting to see that philosophy seems to be having kind of a resurgence, or a renaissance moment, where the philosophy of the academics is now flowing over into the general public through things like podcasting, through things like blogs and groups and communities and all sorts of things, where people are getting more involved in asking these questions around. Here's what I've been interested in, is like, I think a huge part of what we're all doing here, if we're doing anything with this seeking philosophy and bringing it to the public audience, is seeing which words we may have left to the wayside but need to be rediscovered in terms of their real meaning for us. Things like wisdom, like, do we discuss wisdom enough these days? Like, I remember growing up in church, and I'll tell you that, the topic of deeper wisdom and, living in a meaningful, righteous way and all this sort of stuff, it's like that was discussed every single week. And so you go there and you get your source of philosophy and wisdom and, and theology and all this sort of stuff. And so we're talking about deeply meaningful topics. I wonder, in an increasingly secularized world, are we getting enough of these discussions? And also, what are the words that we leave behind? Like, I was thinking about the logos of certain religions, and you think, when you leave a religion, you leave behind words like sacred or holy or righteousness, or perhaps even virtue and wisdom, these sorts of things that are discussed regularly. And you think, don't you think part of what we have to do here is revivify these specific words for people and get them to actually meditate on them and think, what does virtue even mean, and how would I have more of it, and what does it mean for me in my life? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think, that was a lot. That was good. Like a lot.
Sorry, I go off on rambles.
It was like a bunch of different points we could speak to, though. But coming to this idea of words, I think what you mean, or what I assume what you mean, is that words, they signify something. So that signifying is a concept. So it's which concepts do we want to go back to? Which concepts do we want to I think of even this idea of like eudaimonia, of like this like more holistic conception of happiness,
Yeah.
this idea of flourishing. And we end up in this kind of problem where it's like, well, that doesn't really translate to happiness, but flourishing doesn't really get it across. And so what we've done is we've lost a word for this concept,
Yeah.
right? And so much of popularizing of philosophy and so much of the problems come from having to use different words to try to hit on the same concept, right? And you're trying to make these associations. And so when I think of it conceptually, yeah, there's like, which concepts are we talking about? Which concepts are guiding your life? Which concepts do you have access to? And every culture is going to be different, right? So like you, as an Australian, you have a certain set of concepts, and they're probably pretty close to Canadian, but probably quite different than Chinese or something like this. And philosophy and studying and liberal arts educations and all these things, the whole point is that you get access to different concepts. That's like the point of reading a book, is getting access to different perspectives, different ideas, fiction, for example. And I think Stoicism is exactly that, is this paradigm that you can apply. And it's a very helpful and very effective paradigm. It might even be close to being true. But there's still a lot of value to like applying Epicureanism or what Plato has to say, let alone, the existentialists or somebody more contemporary. I think I'm going off on my own tangent now, but
no, it's working, man.
I mean, that's what philosophy is, right? Philosophy is this examination and this interrogation of concepts. And what most people have is they have access to the ones that exist within their current paradigm of their society or the paradigm of their job or their hobby or the people they hang around with. And then they have those not even interrogated. So they have those not even pulled apart or put under a microscope. So philosophy gives you both those things, which gives you the capacity to put these things under a microscope and different things to put under your microscope.
Yeah.
And I think we should always be doing that as much as possible. Try to find the ones that are most helpful for us. Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite authors is Milan Kundera. I don't know if you've read any of his stuff.
No.
Yeah. He's super philosophical, very enjoyable author. And he has just chapters in his books, which are just like words. He just like defines words. And he just like examines their concepts. He just kind of goes over them like one by one and says like, and just kind of pulls them apart and demonstrates how they relate to the story. Yeah. I mean, concept examination is what I like to do in philosophy. And I think it's incredibly, incredibly valuable. So to sum that up, I think there's this idea of being exposed to different concepts is valuable, but then like, you don't even need to be exposed to different concepts. I think people should cultivate the capacity to examine the ones they already have and think more deeply about those.
Yeah. You got to start somewhere. But like, I think I like your analogy of putting it under a microscope. I think Sharon LaBelle, she said, to her, she said, we need to learn how to liberate the wisdom from these ancient books. I like that word liberate, because it's like there's, trapped within these words are these concepts and these ideas that can have the power to completely transform our lives. But we, as the readers or the thinkers, the perceivers, we have our responsibility is to not simply just read them, but it's kind of like what Heraclitus said. He says, he said like those unmindful when they read may be likened unto the walking dead. Now that's a powerful poetic line, right? With like a metaphorical structure underneath it, but nonetheless, it's kind of right. It's like, if you're just reading the words, but you're not thinking like, how does this word specifically fit into this sentence? What does it mean? Then how does this sentence make sense in this paragraph? And then this paragraph in this book, and this book in this in this culture, and this culture in this age. And it's like, man, like there's endless wisdom to be liberated from like a single word or a single sentence. I'll tell you, when you changed me, man, like it was like you taught me that philosophy, that the ancient classical definition of philosophy is actually love of wisdom, to love wisdom. And so the philosopher is somebody who by definition loves wisdom and is seeking wisdom. And that really changed me a lot. And it just made me, oh, sorry, I'm just dropping things here now. It really made me think about this thing that Jim Rohn once talked about, because he said, isn't it funny how we say things like, I couldn't see, the way, but then he told me this, or I read this book, or I heard these lyrics from a song, or, like something like that.
My cat is jumping up here.
Your cat just jumped on the...
This is Gus, which is named after Augustus, so it's perfect.
That's great. Gus. We've got a special guest on the show today.
Yeah, exactly.
So Jim Rohn, he just said, like, it's funny how we say, I didn't see something, but then his words helped me to see. And that's exactly right. Mm-hmm. There's something about words, that there's a relationship between words and sight that, like you literally perceive something completely new and shift direction. You can never be the same again once you truly understand the definition of a certain word, or or once you understand a new concept and idea. I just think it's very interesting that we use that kind of metaphor, right?
Yeah, I think so. So a couple of things, this idea of the philosopher. So in Latin, like the word for science, like scientia, is which is the same word, they just pronounce their C's hard. That just means knowledge. So the scientist is just like the knowledger, like the person in pursuit of knowledge. But I think it's interesting how in our contemporary times, like all the old philosophers were all scientists, mathematicians. Yeah. They were everything. And excuse me.
I'm loving this.
Sorry. 1 second. He jumped on and turned my screen off. There we go. Back on. Yeah. So the scientist, now we think of the person pursuing knowledge as the person who is a scientist, and we kind of limit the capacity to believe we can know things to like the physical world, where philosophers in the day, they had that things that we would call science now, and then they were also doing these things that we now relegate to kind of like the arts, which is just this understanding of more ambiguous things about how to live, how to structure yourself, the nature of the world beyond the physical realm. So I think that's interesting. I think that's interesting that this concept of philosopher, I think, has been like transformed and taken on by scientists. But in that transformation, we've lost that second part of it, the part that you're kind of talking about, which is like seeing the way, and this paradigm transformation but about concepts that don't relate to the physical world and things like this. Yeah, I think that paradigm shifting is super, super important. And so this is probably one of the main values to studying ancient philosophy, is that you're now being asked to do an incredibly empathetic activity, right? Which is to imagine yourself in the shoes of somebody who is a human being. So in some ways is exposed to some fundamental truths, and in some way relates to the world the same as you, but you're also asking to relate to somebody with an entirely different, irreconcilably different conception of the way the world is, and an understanding of even most basic terminology and words. So that empathetic skill, which is what I was talking about before with, even reading fiction, right? Even watching a TV show, practicing that empathetic skill, that capacity, because that's what a paradigm shift is to assume a novel perspective, to assume a perspective that was beyond your capacity to access previously. Right? As opposed to just like learning a new piece of information. Me learning a new piece of information, it's not a paradigm shift. Me changing the way I perceive things, putting on a new lens, new glasses, whatever you want the metaphor to be. So that's basically what you're asked to do when you're doing ancient philosophy. I don't think ancient philosophy has a monopoly on knowledge. I don't think the ancient philosophers are necessarily better than contemporary philosophers. I mean, maybe in some ways I prefer the way they approach philosophy as a way of life, but certainly very smart people doing philosophy today. But what you get there is you get this exercise in like, I'm going to adopt a new perspective about the way the world is. And that's right? Like you'd rather talk to the person who has 100 new concepts to show you than talk to the person from our time who has 5 to show you. And so you get to have those conversations when you read Stoics and when you read ancient philosophers. And that's really, really cool, really valuable.
Interesting that you say you get to have those kinds of conversations when you read the ancient Stoics, because that's exactly what it is, right? I've even been thinking about this with my series on Seneca, because I'll just press record and, start reading a few lines from Seneca and then kind of discuss my own thoughts about what he's saying and add some stuff. And it's like, I'm literally having a conversation with Seneca's ideas, even though I'm not saying, hey, Seneca, how are you today? Like I'm wrestling with it. And I think that that's the right way to conceptualize it. When you're reading, you should be having a conversation. You should be thinking, like, what do I think about this? What do I say about this? And being open enough, as you would in another conversation, hopefully, to say, well, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right. Let's put our ideas up against each other and see if there's anything true in here,
I really, really like this. And I'm going to go back. I'm not as much of an expert in Hannah Arendt as I am in Stoicism. So forgive me if I butcher this, if we have any Arendt scholars listening to this. But Hannah Arendt, do you know Hannah Arendt?
No, I don't. Trust me, I'm not nearly as well read as what people might think I am. Like, and that might also be presumptuous. Maybe people think I'm an idiot. It's not well read. So I'm sorry if I was presumptuous, but go on.
You both hope you're well read and recognize that, or you both hope people think you're well read, but also recognize that if they do, they're probably overshooting.
Probably just I'll call upon Jim Rohn and just say, maybe listen to what I say, but don't watch too close. That's my.
But Hannah Arendt was a modern philosopher who was writing substantially post World War II. So she wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem, which was an examination. Eichmann was the person who coordinated the train systems for the concentration camps. Okay. Where we get this interesting because we also have like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning from the same time period, which is probably the best modern Stoic text there is, or at least closest modern Stoic text that inspires people today. So Eichmann ran the train system. So it was this kind of system of like, how could a person get to this point, right? How could somebody do it? And the main takeaway from that book was about the banality of evil. And what she means is that we think of evil as something brilliant and creative, but evil is not that. Evil is the lack of thought. Evil is the following orders. Evil is the simplicity, the caricatures, the stereotypes, the lack of dynamic thought, right? The rule following. In this way, it's very basic. Also very scary because we're all capable of it. We're all capable of being simple in that way and not philosophical, which she would take as the opposite. But coming back to that, the really thing I liked about that book is she talked about dialogue, right? Which is you're having this conversation between two people. Dialogue is the thinking is a dialogue with yourself, in that when you think, you have to entertain opposite positions, right? You have to contemplate options and weigh them up and consider them. And so what a dialogue is it requires a separation. You can't have unity with dialogue. So when you're thinking, you can't act, because act requires, okay, there's option A, there's option B, that's dialogue, that's thought. Okay, I'm going to pick option A. That's unity, that's action. And so for her, she said, like, unity and action is the realm of the political. The political says, this is the way that things are, this is what you should do. And also in the realm of the political is propaganda. And what separates propaganda from art is that propaganda says the way the world is. Whereas art, Milan Kundera also talks a lot about this, the person I was referencing earlier. Art emphasizes ambiguity, different options, potential.
Mystery.
Right?
Yeah.
Mystery. So where I was connecting this to is that Socrates literally, engages people and forces them into a dialogue about concepts. So you have somebody acting around, they walk around, they go, I know what it means to be a good person. I know what it means to be happy. And they're in action, right? They're in unity. And he forces literally through a dialogue, thinking, separation, possibility, contemplation. And so philosophy is that. And there's this kind of joke about, that's why philosophers are so like bad at doing things, right? So like we're just because
they're always in the world of mystery,
right? They're always in the world of like, well, how can I know that's the right thing to do? How can I act upon that? And that's why Socrates is killed by the Athenian state, right? Because his project is his project is antithetical to politics, right? He's killed by the state, the politicians, the people who want simplicity. And he's accused of corrupting the youth because he's making them question their ideas and their thoughts. And I always thought that was a really, really, I can't remember exactly how I got on that train of thought, but or what the point was that spurred that. But this idea of we were talking about dialogues, yes, and coming back to the Stoics, like they're literally writing in dialogues, right? Like Epictetus doesn't have to write like this. Seneca doesn't have to write like this. They're doing it for a reason, right? And they're doing it for a reason to get you to engage in dialogue. And what is dialogue but the contemplation of opposite perspectives, the engaging in an empathetic act, as opposed to arguing. Arguing is probably like political, and you're trying to push over somebody, but dialogue is empathy. I'm trying to actually understand and incorporate what they have of positive value. And I thought that is a really interesting way of thinking about politics. As philosophy, a really interesting way of thinking about thought and dialogue as this contemplation of ambiguity, mystery. And for Arendt, that's the opposite of evil. That's the opposite of people that do terrible things are the ones that don't question and don't allow that kind of ambiguity, that empathy, and they don't think, basically, at the end of the day.
Okay, I really want to continue this line of thinking, because this is fascinating. This is touching a lot on, and you're helping me to see different things about something that I've been trying to figure out lately. Even like you look at Marcus Aurelius's writings, for example, and I talked about this with Robert. Oh my gosh. Oh crap. I need to get this right. Robin Waterfield. That's it. Just did the new translation of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. I talked about with him saying, it appears to me that, Marcus Aurelius's writings almost fit more into the category of like wisdom poetry or mystical poetry that you might find by somebody like Heraclitus, right? That kind of short form, little bursts of thinking. And I've been spending a lot of time lately, or it's just been on my mind, this idea, like, what is it about these ancient texts that seems to me to be so much more, what's the right word? Engaging, it might be, or deeply meaningful to me than a lot of the stuff that I find today. And I think that it actually has to do with something that you just said there, right? Because it's like the political or the propagandistic or the kind of more solid way of thinking, you might say, is along the lines of like, here's the way the world is and here's what you've got to do, right? And I've been trying to pull myself away from that. Like I always tell my clients, it's like, I'm not going to give you your 10 steps for stoicism and then away you go and you're going to live a happy life. That's not what it's about. And I think that, like, I'm going to say this because it's what I think. It's like, I think that a lot of the books that are being written about stoicism today are books are works of philosophical history, as in they're looking back and they're saying, what are the ideas that the Stoics thought? Okay, here's exactly the 10 steps for how the Stoics thought about the world, or, here's exactly what the Stoics thought, and here, take this away. But what the Stoics were doing, like Seneca, like you say, he's having a dialogue. He's like opening up questions. He's like, he says at times like, this is how it is and this is how it is. But ultimately, I think that the way that they spoke about these things was, to me, the closest I've got to an answer that makes sense to me, that there was soul in their writing. Like they were in their soul, and they were like looking around. It's like you go up there and you think, what's going on up here? And you start to make some assumptions and you put it down on paper. And I don't know, like to me, it just seems like there was something about their writing that they had that really gets you to think and open up your mind in a different way, so that you don't have to be an adherent to a dogmatic philosophy or an ideology, but you're engaging in the process of philosophy, which is to love and seek wisdom. I don't know. What do you think? Like, I might be wrong, but yeah.
No, I think that's great.
I found it.
I think this idea of engaging in philosophy, I don't think, if we think of philosophy as the examination of concepts, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can conceptualize it, but I'm going to be okay to just say that, like, certainly one way to think of philosophy is active thinking, right? Is that I am like in the act of truth pursuing, concept questioning, self-clarification. And I think this is this interesting thing of like, it can feel sometimes if you read a textbook or attend a lecture that you're not doing philosophy, you're learning about philosophy, as you said, like historical.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think I never thought of it that way, but I think that's a profound distinction that you're onto here, where when you're reading a text and you begin engaging in dialogue or thought with this author, you're doing philosophy. When you're when you're reading somebody list the 10 steps, you're learning about somebody else who's done philosophy, right? I think that's a valuable difference. I think you're dead on there, because these people were also not, Plato has dialogues, right?
Yeah.
The very start of philosophy is like Socrates pulling people off the street, and then Plato writing about Socrates pulling people off the street. Like philosophy was Western philosophy, at least, was built on dialogue, was built on conversation, and the Stoics are picking up that tradition, and they're doing it for a reason. Plato didn't write that way. It's harder to write that way than it is for Plato to write down, oh, here are the 5 things that I want you to know. So why is he making this? Why is he writing this like complicated book instead of just getting it down? I think you're hitting on it, because when you read a dialogue, you're doing philosophy, or you're at least reading about other people doing philosophy. Whereas sometimes if you read a text that becomes a nerd, you're just, exactly. I already said that, but I think that's brilliant.
Well, let me throw something else here, right? Because I've been thinking, you might know, I just started a Master of Theology or Master of Divinity. It might cut off short of the Master of Theology, but anyway, the first course that I've taken is on the Old Testament prophets. So really fascinating stuff. Like I'm really, really fascinated by the prophetic tradition. I think it's something that perhaps could be revivified in our modern times, because it's like, at times people had this occupation where they would gain a different vision of the world, and they would stand back and they'd kind of watch things. And the really simplistic kind of idea that I give of a prophet is like somebody who like stands back and can see a different perspective of the culture, and they can see the cyclical nature of history, right? In these patterns repeat themselves. And then they can say, okay, I'm seeing you guys doing a whole bunch of things that we've seen like in the last 100 years. And it's like, if you don't stop, going against the fundamentals of reality here, you're going to get crushed. And so that's going to leave that information with you, But one of the things that I learned about prophets was you had the professional prophets, who were the ones in the temples doing the ordinances, the ones doing all the rituals and stuff like that. They were usually pretty close to the kings. And so they'd just tell the kings what they wanted to hear. And you're going to go and win this battle, good on you, and that sort of thing. But then you had the occupational prophets. Now, these were the prophets who, they were the kinds who would come along and say, like, I can only speak that which God tells me to speak. I'm not going to speak for you, not going to speak for him. I'm only going to speak for God, right? And not only, it was like a calling for them where they felt that they were engaging in this process of channeling deeper wisdom into the culture, but it wasn't like so that they get paid. It was because that's all they knew how to do. It's like what they had to do. And I think you have the same thing with philosophers. It's like, when Seneca writes his epistles, right? I was thinking about this, and I said this in a recent interview. It's like Seneca didn't write his epistles because a book publisher said to him, hey, by the way, Stoicism is really popular today, so we need you to write a book about Stoicism because it's going to fit into the market. He was not a professional philosopher. He was an occupational philosopher, because to him, he was actually trying to wrestle with these questions. And he says it in his writings. He says, I think in his 4th letter, I'm writing these because I want to pass something of value down for the future generations to hold on to. It's like, that's somebody who has a calling, not a book deal. Do you know what I mean? Like, and so to me, I think that there's a big difference there to be discovered in like, what is the role of a professional philosopher? Okay, great. Like, love the professional philosopher, but then there's the occupational philosopher who is engaging in a different process of philosophy altogether. I don't know. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think that resonates with me. I might want to push back on this a bit. Not push back, but
push back.
Interrogate a bit more. I guess I'm curious, in your view, what is different about their projects Like if I didn't know who was who and I read a book by a professional, a book by an occupational, would I be able to tell the difference and why? I'm trying to figure that out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like one way is like, it just kind of sucks, when you see people that are fake or they're doing it for the wrong reasons, it just kind of gives you an icky feeling. But do you think I guess I'm asking you a question. Do you think it changes the art at a fundamental level or the work at a fundamental level? And if so, why?
Well, I think it's a question of aims, right? Like, okay, so let's say you've got two philosophers, right? They both go to a book publisher and they say, hey, I've got some questions I'm trying to answer. I've got some philosophical ideas I'm trying to explore. And I really want to put this out into the world because I think that the ideas I'm trying to explore are meaningful, useful, and will be beneficial to the people in our culture, right? You take a look at somebody like Nietzsche, like he sold very, very few books in his lifetime, right? But he became known as one of the all-time great geniuses, So he wasn't doing it for the market, right? Now, let's say you take these two philosophers, one publishing company says, great, I trust you as an occupational philosopher that, like you're thinking on a certain level, you're trying to grapple with press. I trust that you're going to figure out the correct aims. I trust that you're going to try and figure out the correct motivations for doing this book. And I trust that if you're truly doing your job as an occupational philosopher, then there'll be something of use in your writings for the general public. Now, the other philosopher goes there and the book publisher says to them, I know you're kind of thinking along those lines, but what we really need right now is a book about XYZ, because this is what the market data is telling us that the market needs to hear. Now, if that philosopher decides to say, okay, well, I'll push this stuff aside, and what I'll do is I'll write the book that you want me to write, that to me seems more like the professional philosopher, because they're doing it for the professional aims, as in like what might you say, to further their career through a deal that is they're not okay. They're not setting the terms of their debate. The market is setting the terms of their thinking and their debate, and the publisher is setting the terms of their thinking and debate. Whereas nobody set the terms of like Jung's thinking and debate. He set the terms. Nobody set the terms of Nietzsche's thinking and debate. Like he set that. Do you know what I mean? So I'm trying to draw the distinction between those two worlds.
Yeah. So I guess like one way you could frame this is you could say, I was thinking maybe two ways in which, because I'm interested not just in the intention, but in the output, right? Like why is the output different? Why is somebody doing this for the right reason? Why do they make better philosophy, or they do better philosophy? And I from that I got two things. Is one, I think that like good philosophy is going to be true in some sort of or at least important, or hit upon something important in some sort of atemporal sense.
Yeah.
So when you're like constantly responding to the market, or you're responding to the needs of others, you're going to be doing something that's very circumstantial, very like, right, a response to the current conditions, and it's going to age quite poorly. Another thing that I was thinking about from that was this idea that like good philosophy is very, very, very hard. So you're going to need a combination of skill and passion.
Yeah.
And as soon as you move away from what you're best at and care the most about, you just can't hit that 10 out of 10 anymore, because now you're not, as you said, you're not setting your terms. You're writing in response to something. So I think that might be it. Is I think that like the best works must be things that are done for the right reasons, because they must be what follows out of the person naturally, rather than what follows out of them to like meet a goal, perhaps.
Well, I wonder if it's they must be that, or if it's just you look at history and that's just naturally what we push up. Like if you think, what are the books that have stood the test of time? It's like then you have a pretty solid idea of what has been self-selected by humanity. as the greatest possible thinking. And that's why somebody like, I think you make a really good point here, which is that things that are market driven are not going to stand the test of time because they are circumstantial. And so, they'll speak to the moment. Whereas, somebody like Nietzsche comes along and you think, man, his writings are going to be wrestled with for so long because he wasn't thinking, what can I talk about this? But he was wrestling with the circumstantial or with the circumstance of his time because he was, in many ways trying to figure out this whole death of God situation. It's like, that's circumstantial, but it's also and also I'm not saying that everybody can be a Nietzsche, right? Because that's just not true. It's not wise to think that. But there was something about these great thinkers that they kind of just decided, I'm gonna set the terms of my my debate here, and I'm gonna push the boundaries of my thinking. And I think that's it's interesting. And I think there was something that you said there that actually made me what I did want to say is I also want people to know that I think I don't want to be like ideological on this perspective. It's like, there's value in taking a look at the market and maybe saying, okay, well, how can I align what I'm interested in with what people are wanting right now? Because then, you can kind of guarantee that your writing is going to be useful for something. It's the reason why I started the Practical Stoic podcast, because I thought, I'm using this. Other people might get some value out of it. I can see that they might. There's nothing wrong with that. But I guess I'm just trying to get a better definition of like, what's the occupational philosopher? What's the professional philosopher? Is there a difference there? And I see your perspectives and I like the pushback. It helps me. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of these times, so not only are sometimes people not responding to their times, sometimes people are so far outside their own times that it, ruins their careers and everything, right? Like, so you have Nietzsche as the example, but Kafka is another example that comes to mind. Just somebody that people wanted nothing to do with, right? But then they end up getting, as you said, pushed up by like the selection of humanity over just years. And then another thing, I mean, just to reiterate that, I don't think there's anything wrong with responding, and I think you can actually provide a lot of value to responding to what people need to hear in the moment. It just happens that those end up not necessarily being the things people want to read 2,000 years from now. Those are, and you don't have to write everything with the aim to be like, I'm going to be the Seneca or the Nietzsche. But I guess we're just kind of interrogating the nature of like the really, really the best of the best and what kind of separates them. I think that's fair. I think that is a good criteria that tends to be the case.
And I certainly think that the more you try to be another thing, like let me try and be a Nietzsche, or let me try and be a Seneca, it's like, it doesn't work. It's interesting. I've found that with myself, like the times when I write the best stuff, the stuff that I read back and I think like, that's actually like it works. Speaks to the soul. Is those moments where I try to get out of the way and just see how I write. Not try to be anything else. And it's funny, like things come along. Like I've always wanted to write epistles like Seneca, and then it's finally starting to come through now that I find myself going in that epistle direction. But it's not because I'm saying like I want to write like Seneca. It's because just naturally like the ideas are catching up with my inspiration and it's finally pouring out there. It's interesting. But like I think it's necessary just to write exactly how you write. And then I also kind of fall into the category of Fran Lebowitz. Do you know Fran Lebowitz by any chance? Or
no?
She's like this Jewish New York writer, like just this she's so funny and she's so right most of the time. But one of the things that she says is, she talks about how there's a lot of books out there but not a lot of writers. And in the same way that I believe Epictetus, he said, like, hey, writers write, like, and like you have to learn what you are in this grand scheme of the cosmos, and then you do that, and so did you ever have like that moment where you kind of really knew like, philosophy is the direction that like I feel really deeply engaged in, and this is the thing I'm going to wrestle with? Was there a moment for you where you just felt as though like it was just perfectly aligned with who you are?
Yeah, I think most people who find their passion, especially if it's an intellectual passion or an intellectual community, understand that something's missing or something's off. And then it's not necessarily inspiration as much as it is being comfortable, being like, oh, I finally, you found your tribe, or I found my group of people who kind of share these kind of ideas. I was just kind of, Socrates is annoying. People don't like Socrates for a reason. I was always kind of annoying. And then like frustrated that other people weren't also interested in like asking these kind of questions. And I don't mean that in like obviously I grew up with a lot of very smart people, but there's just this kind of inability to drop stuff that comes with philosophy, or this like focus on like, there is often outside of philosophy, this focus on good enough, like, okay, I'm going to forget. There's this philosopher who has a metaphor of philosophy as like plumbing, right? And so it's conceptual plumbing. Oh, I really should remember this. It's a female philosopher, maybe Mary Midgley. And so it's like, if you have if philosophy has done its job, you have good conceptual plumbing, you don't notice it, right? And it's just, you kind of notice something when a leak happens. And then the philosopher's got to come in and they got to solve the conceptual problem. And they got to fix the leak, and they kind of leave again. But to go with that, there's this view in plumbing of like good enough. I guess I kind of mixing my metaphors here, but there's this view in everything else of like good enough. And what I was interested in was like, well, not good enough. Like, what is the case? What is true there? What is right there? Not I have this idea of like hard work, or I have this idea of virtue that suffices in my day, or like I have enough of an idea of the person I want to be that I can go about in my day to day, and it's good enough. It's like, no, like, what do I really want to be? What do I really value? And that kind of next level. But I went to grad school. I mean, my big moment was, I can remember reading at a bookstore. I was in university. I wasn't liking my psychology degree. And I was thinking about maybe switching into something else, maybe philosophy, because I really liked my elective. And I went to a bookstore and I got the book Plato and a Platypus Walk into the Bar. Have you read this one?
No, I haven't. It sounds great.
Telling philosophy through jokes. And I just sat down and read like half the books, and I just like had fun. And it was just this process of like, I'm enjoying this. This is like really interesting to me. And that sounds kind of trivial, but that's really all it is. I would say is like, find that thing that you have fun while you're doing it. It checks those boxes. Yeah. And that was it for me. It was like, if I was the kind of person who picked up a math textbook and had fun reading 100 pages of that math textbook, I should probably go into math. Just find that thing that there's a spark there. And that was it for me. But like most people, I think, you don't know it exists, right? So you're a kid and you've played soccer, you've played basketball. And if you had a passion for those, because you went to basketball practice, but there's no philosophy practice. There's no philosophy class, all the way up until university. So for me, the moment was obvious, or the moment, maybe not obvious, but it was easy to find once I had somebody in front of me being like, this is philosophy, try it, see if you like it. And I was like, oh, I do like this. I mean, some more, please.
That's exactly right. Some more, please. Yeah.
But the problem was not knowing that flavor existed until I was, already in university. And I think that's the value of what you're doing, or the value of public philosophy in general, is like, people don't know this stuff exists, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And I've been thinking a lot more lately that, one of the big caveats that I have to, put in people's faces when I do this podcast is to say, I'm doing this podcast, and I'm doing philosophy, and I'm doing coaching, and I'm doing music and poetry and all these things because I feel deeply called within the depths of my being to do this sort of thing. It is an occupational love that I'm doing here. And that might not be the same thing for you. I think like a lot of people, when they get into something like Stoicism, it's easy to think, I need to become, for me, it was like, I need to become the philosopher, but I was doing it out of like a real passion for this sort of stuff. But the philosopher's task is not to teach people necessarily to be more philosophers by definition, other than like the lovers of wisdom. It's to teach them to understand, or the practical philosopher anyway, to teach them to be more of themselves, like who they truly are, to actually discover what it is that what role they play in our culture that would be meaningful and useful for them and everybody else. And you're right, like that's the biggest problem, right? It's like you don't You don't know something that you can't see. And so we're
Mhm.
always, and that's why I think I've been really focusing lately on, how do you learn how to actually feel virtue in your bones? It's like that moment when you feel like you're in the right place at the right time doing the right thing. Because if you can learn how to feel that, then you can kind of look back at your life and you can think, when are those moments when I was doing something where I was fully engaged, not necessarily intellectually as in I think I was definitely there. It's like, no, it's like in your body, you felt completely alive doing that thing. And if you can learn what that is, then you can start to put the pieces together and say, oh, maybe all these things point towards this direction for me now. And I think it's kind of an open question how good things could get if people decided to stop looking without and blaming the world for all the issues and everything like that, but actually looking within and saying, how can I sit in, like Sharon LaBelle said this, and it always stuck with me. How can I sit in my seat in the theater of life? Like the place that I'm supposed to sit in and do that really well.
I guess you have to find the seat, and then you have to be okay sitting there. So I guess you kind of have two things.
It's difficult, right? And you're right. It's really difficult to be okay sitting in your seat because it takes a lot of trust. And then you have to think, well, what am I trusting? Like, am I trusting in the Taoist sense, the kind of the Tao that flows through all that, or in the Stoic sense, am I trusting in the Logos that I will be, be able to navigate this without, forcing myself in other directions? It's like, it's because I've personally found that the more I let go, the better the stuff that I put out becomes, and that has to do even with, before the conversation today, I said to you, let's not do like an interview style. Let's just have a conversation. Let's just see where we take it. And I'm so glad that we did, because we've been going down interesting directions. Anyway, I think you wanted to jump in there, but I just kept on rambling.
No, I was just commenting on the seat metaphor. I mean, I think there's a lot there. I think one thing that you're talking about that I think I'm going to be interested as you kind of develop your thought on this. And there's like a lot of there's a kind of privileging in your view of a kind of like experiential knowledge. And there's I would call it experiential knowledge of kind of being in the moment or being present. Yeah. And there's kind of a separation of that from like thinking or thoughts. And I think that's a lot to wrestle with. And I think that's an interesting view. And I think that there's something we have metaphors for this, right? We talk about our gut, or we talk about our conscience, or we talk about these kind of other sense of the sixth sense or something like this. And I think that's an interesting concept. And I think I agree with you that we should seek out those kind of moments where we were kind of unified in that sense between the mind, the gut, and the, whatever, everything else was kind of, and that kind of allowed this presentness without this otherness. I agree that we should seek those out. And I think that those are important. But at the end of the day, like, just bring it back to that self-forgiveness. Sometimes that just comes down to doing things that you don't like, you didn't like, and you realized, oh, that's what that felt like, to like be something that wasn't engaging me, Yeah. So there's also, there's this idea of like, follow your passion, go with your gut. And I think there's also value, if you don't do that, to kind of like learn about the pains of not doing that, or get a better view for like, oh, I have a better sense of what I love to do because I spent a couple of years doing something I didn't love.
Yeah.
I guess there's kind of there's a versatility of that. Because I think sometimes when we say that, it can loop back. I don't think you were saying it that way, but it can loop back to kind of that idea of like shame of like, if you're not living 100% authentically right now, how dare you? You're not. And it's like no, there's this being authentic is this like problem solving where you try to figure out what authentic, you try to find that seat. You sit down in some other seat and you're like, oh no, it's not the one for me. But it's better than you not sitting in any, or it's better than you picking the wrong seat right at the start and being like, no, 100%, this is my seat. I know it because I'm authentic and I'm living in that spot. So I now that you were not implying otherwise, but I think, and more saying this for myself as well, there's this value to experimentation as you figure out what that authenticity looks like for you.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Experimentation 100%. Like I feel like personally I've arrived at a place where I really understand a few things about myself, like a few
Mhm.
really important directions that I need to go. But I didn't get there, in a second. It was like, I've done so many different things. I've gone and managed gyms, or been on cruise ships playing music, and like all these
Yeah,
different
yeah.
sorts of things. I'm the kind of person who never finished anything. I was always just jumping about, but now I've finally found places to sit, right? Um, but I think what I'm interested in is like, we need to learn how to feel something, and we need to learn how to
Mhm.
listen to what we feel and how the body tells us things, right? But also, like, I'm interested in, now that you can learn how to feel those things, you also, like, we can make a logical argument why you should learn how to feel that stuff. And we can make a logic, like, then when you feel a certain thing, you can make a logical argument for whether or not this is a feeling that is worth, assenting to, or not, or and this is in many ways why I brought Sharon LaBelle and Kai Whiting on with me in this project for the Walled Gardeners, because there's this line from Alan Watts where he talks about how, the world is always divided in between prickles and goos. You've got the prickly
Mm.
academics. They think the world is very, very prickly and very kind of the very intellectual, very, very logic driven, that sort of stuff. But then you've got the artists, so
Mhm.
Sharon LaBelle probably fits more into the artist type, which is, the world is very gooey, very mystical, very, strange and peculiar and unknowable ultimately. And so when you bring those worlds together, Alan Watts says, the thing is, like, they're always at odds with each other, but the thing is, the world's actually not just prickles or goo, it's gooey prickles and prickly goo, right? and
Mhm.
and so if we can bring the feeling together with the intellectualizing, it's like, that's a strong case for, like, so I'm interested in doing both of those things, but as an artist, I find that I always just fall into that very mystical way of looking at the world.
Oh, you go
But
goo by, if you're
I
not
go
careful,
go.
you just go full goo.
I go. That's exactly right. I go full hardcore goo. Like, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe people have got that from the podcast, or maybe not. But that's the that's the general direction I tend. But yeah, man, I have to. I'm going to try and be respectful of your time here, and I do want to make sure that. So I interviewed Caleb Ontiveros, a few weeks ago on the podcast, and now I'm glad to hear that you're officially working with him, right? So, like, talk to me. What's going on there?
Yeah, so I mean, if anybody stayed along this long and is still listening, then they're at least a little bit interested in, hopefully, in the kind of stuff I'm working on and doing right now.
Yeah,
So
man.
leaving philosophy, I wanted to still have a way. So one way that I conceptualized my leaving of academia is that I think, let's say at the end of my PhD, my knowledge is about an 8, and I think this is something you could really empathize with. My calling and my interest is not really moving from an 8 to a 9 to a 10, which becomes very slow. And I spend the rest of my life moving from an 8 to an 8.5, and then I die. I want to take that 8, that, like, my understanding of Stoicism, and help other people who are still learning, right? Help them kind of navigate
Yeah,
with the work that I've put in. And that's kind of where my passion is. Like, I've gotten good
yeah,
enough that I feel comfortable guiding people at least through this part, you know?
yeah,
Um, and so what I wanted to do after leaving academia was still be involved in the Stoic community and still be involved in helping people learn about and practice philosophy.
yeah,
So what I've done is I've joined up with Caleb at Stoa. And what Stoa is it's a meditation, journaling, and theory app on Stoicism. Um, but the point is kind of what we were talking about with that app is, I want to give people an opportunity. I mean, it relates exactly what we're talking about. I want to give people an opportunity to do philosophy,
yeah,
right? So much of what you're doing is you kind of sit and you're reading about philosophy, and we want to help people do philosophy. So the way the app is structured, is it has, daily meditations along with a bunch of other meditations based on theme, meditation courses for you to practice. We've been talking about plugging into your feeling, plugging into kind of your mind, your sensations. And I find meditation is really, really helpful practice for that, and helpful way to kind of um, get in touch with thinking carefully about these concepts and these questions, right? Especially if you're
yeah,
meditating on a specific theme. Um, and then other than that, you don't want to just meditate. You want to use that in a Stoic framework and a Stoic context. So we also have theory. We also have conversations with experts. So we have a conversation with you on Stoa, talking about the work that you do, and so it's a collections of resources to help people practice. And I'm super passionate about that. I'm super happy about that because I want this to be something accessible. At the end of the day, Stoicism is something that I got into because of, I was able to take philosophy courses in university, right? Not everybody's in that position. And that's also not the best way to learn for everybody. A lot of people learn better by doing. So we're trying to provide that. And I think it's a good project, and I would love for people to try it out. And we would also love to hear feedback and engage in the community, because at the end of the day, we're trying to make the best app possible and the best way to help people learn.
Yeah, man. And I'd imagine your understanding of Epictetus's kind of pedagogy is that's going to come in real handy there, right? Like, is that what you're thinking as you're doing this PhD, is like, this is going to be useful to actually help people to see the pathway of Stoicism, like how it teaches you to be, philosophically minded?
Oh, absolutely. Like, I'm interested in progress. That's what I'm interested in. Right. Like everything in my own life, I think if there was a unifying theme, everything in my life I found meaningful has been progress. It's not been being there. It's the journey, not the destination. It's been self-transformation. And along with self-transformation, I'm interested in helping other people transform, because it's just like, this is what's given me the most meaning, and I want to help other people have it. And so Epictetus is the guy who's like, provides that Stoic outlook on that. And this is how a Stoic can structure their training. So yeah, absolutely. I've stolen it or at least incorporated the parts that I think are valuable, or the parts that I think work today. But yeah, I'm just interested in teaching, working together, helping others, and, helping myself through this process. So yeah, those are just the topics that interest me. So naturally, like, moving to the Stoa app was just a very natural switch.
Yeah. Well, I'm really excited to see that, we're now in a time where, people have so much opportunity to find their little, group or community of people who are wrestling with the same sorts of questions as them. And, obviously, it can go in the tribalistic direction, but, in Stoicism, you see a really interesting thing happening now. I think this is the thing that I'm trying to participate in as well, with the Walled Garden, is saying, if I was to set up my own philosophical school, how would I do that? Caleb did that with the Stoa app. It's like the Stoa app is a philosophical school where you can go to learn about philosophy and how to use it in your life. And you're participating in that as well. And in the same way that modern Stoicism did that, they've got their school. And it's such a fascinating time where we have so much opportunity to do that, right? And I just think it's great that you were able to move into something like that after your PhD.
Oh, I was super happy about it, because I did not want to. Philosophy is just an important part of my life, and I think part of philosophy, Stoa is most people would know this, but the Stoa is, the painted colonnade, the porch where the Stoics met. Philosophy is collaborative. It is dialogue. It is working with other people. So I want to continue to do philosophy, not just continue to read about philosophy. That distinction that we managed to pull out during this conversation is going to be very helpful for me moving forward. And like, I can sit at home and I can buy books and I can read, and there's a lot of value to that. Same way I like to read about all kinds of topics, but the Stoa app is designed to help you do, and that has to be something that's collaborative, engage with other people. We're also right now doing workshops on there. So where people come and ask questions, and we talk and we brainstorm topics, because I think that's something we just added, because I think it's a really important part of doing philosophy.
Yeah.
But I'm so happy. It's just so cosmopolitan now. We're very, very lucky. We live on other sides of the planet, right? And we've developed a kind of a friendship around philosophy and discussing Stoicism. And we're super lucky to live in that time. And the Stoa app's able to exist because of that. But as you said, other great resources like Modern Stoicism, the Practical Stoic, or the Walled Garden, these are just resources that are able to exist and influence people because of the time that we're at. It's a great time to be into philosophy. You don't have to take a boat over to where Epictetus is teaching.
Yeah. And that's actually a question I wanted to ask just quickly was, and then I'm gonna wrap up the interview. But So talk to me about the actual setup of Epictetus's school. So like, how long do we know anything about like how long people would spend with him, or like, what what was the setup of the school?
Yeah, I'm going to acknowledge that I'm quite bad historically. I should.
Okay.
It's part of there being. There's not a lot of information on this. There's not a lot of clear information on this. Um, and that's part of me as a philosophy nerd. I get kind of pulled into the ideas instead of the circumstances, which I should. Basically, it was Nicopolis, which was a city in Greece. It was a lot of Roman citizens, and it was primarily young men. Um, I don't know off the top of my head, but my assumption is it would be like a period of years. It would be an extended period of time. They're not coming there for a week or two crash course. Perhaps a year or longer. But it was primarily young men at the end of their education who were then going to enter into roles in politics or higher up roles, receiving a Stoic education.
Mm.
And it was we talk a lot about the practice, but there was also like an extensive what we would consider kind of a liberal arts education, where there's thorough reading texts, there is learning how to do formal logic, there is writing papers, or at least composing your thoughts about a piece that you've done. So there was that whole academic part. And then there was engaging in these like difficult conversations with each other and with Epictetus. But yeah, it was, similar to someone who goes off to school, right, and comes back. It's the same kind of model. So you'd be a young person, you'd leave home, you'd engage in this, and then you'd come back, and hopefully you take the best parts of it. I'm sure some people left it. I'm sure some people changed their mind or thought it was baloney. But it was kind of this, because it was isolated. It was this immersion for these people, right? Who would leave their area. They wouldn't go back to their normal homes, right? They would stay there and learn, and then leave.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating, because I never knew that it was so specific in terms of, like, you say you've been researching the pedagogy. My perception of Epictetus was always just, that here's a guy who's sitting around in a round circle sort of thing and talking to his students, and like we'll be giving a certain sermon for today and then a certain one tomorrow. But I never thought that it was as as structured as what you're saying here.
Yes, like logic classes, readings, assignments, things like this. I mean, it was very similar to like a university education.
Very interesting. Yeah.
No, there's still quite a bit. I was talking to Erland McGillivray, who he wrote a book on Epictetus and lay people. So he wrote a book about Epictetus's relationship with non-philosophers. But he's was telling me about Nicopolis, which is actually quite well preserved. And not quite as broken down as other places. So I'm gonna visit one day, because Epictetus talks about the theater and going in and like conducting yourself well in the theater around other people, but like that theater still exists, it's still there. So I'll have to go one day and walk around and see all the stuff. It'll be cool.
Yeah, man. Oh man, it'd be so good to spend some time in Europe, going to all these places and just just being in that place. But look, I have just one more question for you. I wanted to ask this earlier, but then I thought maybe I'll save it for last. When you look around the culture at the moment, when you see kind of what's happening in the world at the moment, I don't know if you keep up with it, but we all get it by just osmosis. I think just with the amount that we all talk about things these days. But nonetheless, when you look at the world, and you think about your role as a philosopher for the rest of your life, you're going to be grappling with these questions. I guess what problems are you excited about tackling? What do you think is your like frontier of I guess contributing to the culture, and problems, opportunities? I'm just going to throw that out there and see what you think. Let me throw that out there without really a question.
Yeah, it's another big question. I mean, so the first way I think about philosophy in general is, the life worth living, the unexamined life is not worth living, right? So it's this question of just like, you need to live intentionally. And I don't care I don't care what value system you adopt, live intentionally in your value system and be willing to argue for it and defend it. Right. And that's what, for me, what separates Stoicism from religion. And I'm sure there's some religion that's open to this, but certainly not all, which is that Stoicism, or the ancient Greek philosophies, were complex value systems about how to live, about what happens when you die, but they were willing to argue it and they were willing to debate it. And I always come back to that Marcus Aurelius line about, like, I'm interested in the truth. You know, if you could prove to me that Stoicism was wrong, I would believe your school instead. Like, I'm not dogmatic in that sense. So people living intentionally, people questioning what they come to believe when they live intentionally and be willing to give it up. And one thing I think about, that's something I want to push for. Another thing is Epictetus talks about, which is protreptic philosophy. So protreptic is the Greek word for turning somebody towards something. And this is basically like motivational things, inspiring things. So some of Epictetus's philosophy is not meant to teach you anything. It's just meant to pump you up. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that popular philosophy has that role of taking something that can be very boring, can be very dry, and being protreptic, is turning people towards it, exposing people to it. Because I think that's the main problem in philosophy, is that most people don't know about it, right? It's undiscovered. And like, if you tried it and you're like, oh, it's not for me, I'm going to have this other hobby instead, or I'm going to think about my life carefully through my art, or, you know, through my relationship with my family. It's like, good, cool, that's great. But you can't make that decision unless you've been exposed to it. So this kind of popularizing, protreptic, inspiring function. The other thing that I'm interested in, so living intentionally, the other question that I'm interested in is this question of, I guess it's kind of like epistemic humility, which is kind of a complex way of saying it, but gaining an understanding of what you know well, gaining an understanding of what you don't know well, and gaining a reasonable deference to experts in those areas. And that comes back to Socrates, right? That also comes back to Epictetus, which is the first part of philosophy, is to like admit your ignorance, because you can't learn something you believe you already know. But I think we could benefit from a lot more humility. And I think that the ironic benefit of the PhD is the PhD taught me humility, because I spent 5 years learning something and I still don't know everything there is to know, but I still have people who could, walk circles around me in a variety of different ways about a variety of different topics. Right. And understanding of like, wow, it took me 5 years to get this good, and there's still so much I can improve on, is a real humility about everything else I know. And I don't know if you ever have this experience. Sometimes I go on this where I use Reddit, and I'm using Reddit to like learn about different things. So, I'm interested in this topic, I'll go on the community. And then sometimes I'll go on like the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Reddit, for example, or maybe the Stoicism Reddit, and you'll read somebody say something, you're like, oh, that's terrible, that's so wrong. And you're like, oh no, everything else and every other thing has been that incorrect too, but I haven't noticed it because I don't know as much. But just that kind of intellectual, which is like a sad experience. But gaining that kind of intellectual humility and cautiousness, I don't know, that's something that I think I've really benefited from, and my main takeaway after my PhD. And hopefully you can inspire that. And I think that comes with living intentionally, living carefully, and clarifying concepts. I think you gain that humility through doing philosophy. So they're related.
Yeah, man, absolutely. I mean, there's just so much. There's so much that our culture offers us from, in terms of wisdom of the past. To imagine that we can even scratch the surface of, understanding all of these things that everybody's been wrestling with for all this time. It's like, yeah, man. But look, I just want to thank you. This has been really fun. And I don't think we even, scratched on, half of what we could have talked about today. So we're going to have to do this on a more regular basis. I think it'd just be good to maybe next time we get Kai involved as well, get him on here and, have a round table sort of discussion. But yeah, thank you. And everybody knows, hopefully, to go to the Stoa app, found in every good app store near you, I think.
Well, yeah.
Anything else you want to let everybody know before we sign off?
No, I mean, just
can they get your PhD? Can they read it?
Yeah, so that is online. It's up on Queens. I don't know if I've actually posted it anywhere else. I mean, I posted it on my social media channels and things like this, but these things are kind of related, which is that, I mean, I'm sure if you Google my thesis, you'll get it. Like if you look that up, but I think I always like to say is like, I like engaging with people. I like talking about stoicism. So if anybody wants to pursue any of these topics further, or wants to reach out, or wants to talk about anything, like just, Google me, you'll find the email, reach out to me, message me on Twitter, anything like this. Yeah, because I just want this to be a community. I don't want this to be a thing where I talk and I don't expect people to listen non-engagedly or non-questioningly, or like I like discussing these things. So if people want to reach out, please do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Michael, thank you again. And until next time.
Thanks so much, Simon.
You've been listening to the Walled Garden podcast. For more episodes just like these, or to join our community, go to thewalledgarden.com. See you there.